Our topic is the history of U.S. debt.
What is debt?
Debt is the amount of money owed to a lender that is borrowed. It is made of like an accumulation of budget deficits.
What are budget deficits?
Budget deficits are like an excess of expenditures over revenues. Expenditures are like the money spent by the government, which are like include Social Security and military. Revenues include like what they bring in as far as money, which is like sales taxes and income taxes.
What exactly is the U.S. debt?
The U.S. debt specifically is the sum of all debt that the federal government is owing to its creditors. Like that includes individuals, corporations, businesses, or other organizations that own government debt securities.
Name a few government debt securities.
Debt securities include things such as savings bonds, treasury notes, and bills. And since these are so reliable, especially the government bonds, they provide like a steady monetary source for the government from its buyers.
There's two different types of debt, internal and external.
What is internal debt?
Internal debt is publicly held debt or intergovernmental holdings, which is basically when the government borrows money from itself, like Social Security.
What is external debt?
External debt is when the government borrows money from different countries, and we borrow the most money from China and Japan. U.S. debt can be split into three different parts: the U.S. Treasury, which actually creates the debt, and then the Bureau of Public Debt, which actually manages the debt, and then the Congress, which decides how to spend the money.
Even before America was founded in 1776, debt existed. During the American Revolutionary War, we got money from France and the Netherlands to fund our war, so it just started that whole debt issue. And in 1789, the Department of the U.S. Treasury was created to manage and help this debt. The first U.S. Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, composed the earliest calculation of the U.S. debt. His calculations date back to 1790, stating that the U.S. debt was higher than $75 million. However, Hamilton wasn't all that concerned about paying off the debt, which would eventually become a serious issue for the U.S. The next major surge of debt was during the Civil War. When it ended in 1865, the U.S. government debt was $2.6 billion. Then in 1914, the U.S. entered World War I under President Wilson. By the end of the war, our national debt was $25 billion. Not long after World War I, in 1917, Congress created a maximum amount of debt the federal government can have, known as a debt ceiling, ensuring that U.S. debt would remain within reasonable boundaries.
Thankfully, due to the booming economy of the Roaring Twenties under President Calvin Coolidge, debt shrunk to $17 billion. Years later, after the Great Depression, the role of the government grew under President Roosevelt through his New Deal plan, which was created to transition smoothly out of the Great Depression. Due to the government running and paying for the new programs, the debt jumped by 150% from 1930 to 1939 to a total of $44.4 billion. Shortly after these new programs were created, World War II erupted in 1930, causing the debt to increase drastically to $258 billion by the end of the war.
Debt wasn't as much of an issue during these first wars because the only deficit spending was due to military spending to fund these wars. After the wars were done, we didn't have military spending anymore, so it wasn't an issue. Okay.
The national debt continued to increase during the 1950s to the 1980s.
Specifically because of what?
Because of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and other government programs such as Medicare.
Eventually leading to a national debt of $845 billion in 1979 under President Reagan. Between 1980 and 1990, the debt more than tripled to $3.6 trillion. In 2001, under President Bush, when 9/11 occurred, the government splurged on military spending and homeland security, adding another heavy toll on the national debt. Next, the 2008 housing crisis and the $700 billion bailout caused the national debt to increase to $10.5 trillion.
Today, President Obama is one of the biggest contributors to our national debt because he extended Bush's tax cuts and he focuses on the economic stimulus package and he increased the military spending. Because of this, the gross accumulation of debt now equals
the total amount of the U.S.'s GDP. The biggest issue as far as deficit spending today is the government's borrowing from the Social Security Fund. They take the 6.2% out of our paycheck to help us retire later on by giving that money back. Of course, while they borrow from it, what if we don't get the money back? Let's talk. Let's talk to a baby boomer.
And what are we going to do about our Social Security?
As of May 12, 2013, the U.S.'s debt is now $16.7 trillion.